Hey guys, tonight we're heading east, far from the castles of Europe and into the land of samurai, emperors, and an almost pathological dedication to hierarchy. Welcome to feudal Japan. If you're already tucked in, that's good, because this story is long, complicated, and full of polite misery. We're talking about a society where the wrong bow could ruin your life. Peasants worked themselves into early graves, and samurai spent decades learning how to look cool while repressing every human emotion. So, let's dim the lights, take a deep breath, and float back to a time when Japan was ruled not by one person, but by layers upon layers of people telling each other what to do. All the way from the emperor down to the rice farmers, who were basically human tax machines. Feudal Japan roughly spans from the late 12th century all the way to the mid-19th century, about 700 years of order, chaos, war, peace, and bureaucracy. It started when the imperial court lost its grip and the country fell into the hands of military lords called daimyo. These were the guys who owned land, commanded samurai, and treated politics like an elaborate sword fight where everyone smiled before stabbing each other in the back. At the very top sat the emperor, a sort of divine mascot who, by the later centuries, had almost no real power. Below him was the shogun, the military ruler who actually controlled things. Think of the emperor as the figurehead on the front of a fancy ship. Beautiful, revered, but mostly decorative. The first shogunate, the Kamakura, was founded by Minamoto no Yoritomo around 1192. He was one of those men who seemed allergic to peace. After years of fighting to secure power, he finally created Japan's first true military government. And because the Japanese love a good system, they made sure everything after that followed a strict pattern of feudal order. The social structure was neat and merciless. At the top, samurai and their lords. Below them, farmers who were technically respected for producing food, but still had to hand over most of it. Below them, artisans who made things nobody could afford. And at the bottom, merchants, people considered morally suspicious for making money without doing real work. It's funny how societies always find a way to hate the people who handle cash. For peasants, life was predictable in the worst way. Imagine endless rice paddies, heavy humidity, and the faint hope that your lord wouldn't raise taxes that year. You lived in a thatched hut with walls thin enough for the wind, and your neighbour's gossip, to come right through. You worked from sunrise to sunset, bowed a lot, and tried not to think about how short your lifespan was. Diseases were constant companions. Food shortages happened every few years. And because Japan is a country that loves a good natural disaster, there were always earthquakes, floods, and typhoons waiting to destroy what little progress you'd made. The people didn't rebel much, though. The system drilled obedience deep into everyone's bones. You knew your place, and that place was usually near mud. If you got lucky, you might end up serving in a samurai household as a servant or craftsman, which sounds glamorous until you realize it mostly involved cleaning armor, sharpening swords, or running errands while trying not to make eye contact with anyone of higher rank. And speaking of samurai, let's talk about them. Because while pop culture paints them as noble warriors with perfect hair and strict moral codes, their reality was a bit more uneven. Samurai were expected to follow Bushido, the way of the warrior. It was all about loyalty, self-discipline, and honor, which basically meant being ready to die whenever your lord said so. Sounds heroic, but in practice, it was also a great way to keep soldiers obedient, You couldn't question orders. You couldn't complain. You couldn't even show fear. The best samurai were those who didn't flinch when everything went wrong, or when asked to commit ritual suicide to make up for someone else's mistake. Because yes, seppuku was a thing. A samurai who failed, embarrassed his master, or broke protocol could redeem himself by disemboweling his own abdomen in a very solemn and frankly unnecessary ceremony. The idea was that it proved courage and sincerity. The reality was that it turned honor into an extreme sport. Samurai also weren't always fighting epic battles. During long stretches of peace, especially under the Tokugawa shogunate, they became bureaucrats. Many spent their lives reading documents, managing lands, and enforcing tax codes. Basically, highly trained warriors turned into paper pushers in fancy robes. You can imagine the existential crisis. The Tokugawa period, starting around 1603, was Japan's great lockdown phase. The country sealed itself off from most of the outside world. Foreign trade was restricted, and the government kept an obsessive eye on everyone's behavior. Stability was everything, even if it meant crushing individuality. Daimyo were required to spend alternating years in Edo, modern Tokyo, leaving their families behind as hostages to guarantee loyalty. It was a polite kind of surveillance. Oh, you're free to rule your lands. Just remember your wife and kids are staying with us. Commoners had their movements restricted. Farmers had to stay in their villages. Merchants were monitored. Even clothing was regulated. Laws dictated what colors and fabrics people could wear. The idea was that order came from knowing your place and never stepping out of it. And this rigid system lasted for centuries. People were born into their social class and almost never escaped it. Your ancestors' job was probably your job. Your descendants too. Ambition was not encouraged. In fact, humility and endurance were considered virtues. The phrase shikata ga nai, it can't be helped, might as well have been the motto of the era. Still, within all that repression, Japanese culture flourished in quietly stunning ways. While peasants worked and samurai brooded, art thrived. The tea ceremony, flower arranging, calligraphy, and haiku all became refined, meditative outlets for expressing emotion. Indirectly, of course, haiku poets like Matsubasho found beauty in the fleeting and the ordinary. A frog jumping into a pond, a breeze rustling through bamboo. These were the great moments of life, captured in 17 syllables. It was a subtle rebellion against the rigidity of the world. You couldn't change your social rank, but you could notice the perfection in a falling leaf. Meanwhile, urban entertainment districts grew in cities like Edo and Kyoto. Kabuki theatre became wildly popular, full of drama, music, and forbidden excitement. Merchants might have been despised socially, but they were often the ones funding all the fun. A quiet irony the samurai probably noticed and hated. Let's float now to the homes of those samurai bureaucrats, sipping their tea, quietly regretting their life choices. They'd trained their whole lives for war, memorized strategy, mastered weapons, and then peace came, leaving them unemployed with too much pride to farm and too little skill to trade. Some adapted, others didn't. Many turned to philosophy, poetry, or drinking. The stereotype of the melancholy samurai, sitting under a cherry blossom tree contemplating impermanence, isn't far off. The thing about feudal Japan is that it was both incredibly disciplined and quietly tragic. Everyone had a role, everyone had a duty, and yet, under all the politeness, there was exhaustion. Generations lived and died without much changing. power remained concentrated. Suffering was expected, and beauty, whether in art, nature, or fleeting joy, was often the only escape. So tonight, as we begin this slow journey through samurai codes, peasant struggles, and the quiet poetry of endurance, just breathe. Because if you think your day was long, imagine living 7 centuries under the weight of obligation. We'll pick up again in part 2, where life gets even trickier. When samurai honor meets peasant rebellion, monks start stockpiling weapons, and the world's politest feudal system finds itself wobbling under its own perfection. Part 2. Daily life. Samurai drama and the peasant aesthetic of misery. Let's drift back into the dusty, rice-scented air of medieval Japan. We've already set the stage, the shoguns ruling from on high, samurai swinging swords for honor points, and peasants doing, well, everything else. Now let's look at what daily life actually felt like in this rigid, polite dystopia we call feudal Japan. If you were a peasant, and statistically, you almost certainly were, your entire existence orbited around rice, growing rice, counting rice, giving rice to your lord, eating rice if you were lucky. It wasn't just food, it was currency. Imagine if your paycheck was edible, but your boss demanded most of it back every month. That was basically the Japanese tax system. You'd wake before sunrise, work the paddies until your back screamed, then collapse in your tiny thatched hut. No chairs, no shoes indoors, no fun. If you were married, your spouse was probably working beside you, equally exhausted. Romance was practical, and hygiene, while better than in medieval Europe, a low bar, was still not ideal when you spent half your life in a swampy rice field. And while you were bending your spine to keep your daimyo, feudal lord, well fed, the samurai class was busy perfecting the art of standing still. Seriously, samurai were all about composure, the aesthetic of stillness. To lose your temper was to lose your honor, unless of course your lord lost a war, in which case you'd lose your head, balance. Samurai weren't just warriors. They were also bureaucrats and philosophers. Some even wrote poetry about cherry blossoms and mortality between bouts of stabbing. One could spend an entire afternoon contemplating a single falling leaf and call it personal growth, which sounds lovely, except for the part where you also had to be ready to commit ritual suicide at any moment to prove your loyalty. And yes, that's seppuku, the infamous gut-stabbing ritual. It wasn't as common as Western movies make it out to be, but it did happen. Usually it was a way to say, my bad, in the most dramatic way possible. You see, in feudal Japan, dying with grace was just as important as living with purpose, which sounds poetic until you realize most people didn't get to choose either. Let's glide for a moment into the lives of women, because contrary to samurai legends, women weren't exactly practicing sword arts in silk robes. Peasant women worked the fields like men. No rest, no glory. Samurai women, on the other hand, had one clear job: preserve the family's honor, which usually meant marrying strategically, managing the household, and keeping the samurai ego stable. But don't underestimate them. Some were trained in naginata, polearm combat, mainly to protect their homes when men were away. So yes, medieval Japan technically had home defense moms, but even among the elite, your social rank defined everything. What you wore, how you bowed, what kind of wood your sandals were made from. The wrong outfit could get you ridiculed. The wrong tone of voice could get you punished. And if you were wondering what fashion looked like back then, layers. So many layers. Imagine sweating through 12 layers of silk in the humid Japanese summer. just so you could look graceful. The noble class must have smelled like a floral swamp. Let's float over to the religious side of things. Because in a society built on suffering and obedience, spirituality was the ultimate coping mechanism. Buddhism was the chill one, reminding everyone that life is suffering but also temporary. Shinto, the native religion, was more animistic, full of spirits in trees, rivers, and rocks. Combine them, and you get a worldview that says, everything is alive, everything is sacred, and your problems are part of the cosmic balance, which was a nice thought to have while freezing to death in winter. Monks, meanwhile, were kind of the influencers of the time. They wrote scrolls, told moral stories, and occasionally got rich. Some temples even became military powers. Yes, literal monk armies, which is just as absurd as it sounds. Imagine peaceful, bald men in robes marching to war because someone insulted their Buddha statue. Now let's drift to the towns, because while the countryside lived by the rhythm of rice, urban Japan was slowly developing its own rhythm, trade, gossip, and the beginnings of art as we know it. Merchants, the chonin, were technically at the bottom of the social ladder since they didn't produce anything. But guess who had all the money by the late medieval period? The merchants. They were the quiet power brokers, funding samurai debts and influencing politics with their wallets. Of course, they had to pretend they were humble about it, because showing wealth in public was seen as vulgar. So they'd hide their silk robes under plain cotton and drink expensive tea behind closed doors. Speaking of tea, yes, the tea ceremony. It's one of the most famously Zen parts of Japanese culture, and in medieval times it was like the original mindfulness exercise. You'd sit still for an hour, pour tea with slow precision, and pretend you weren't judging everyone else's technique. Every gesture was deliberate, every silence was meaningful. It was both art and subtle social warfare, the Japanese version of power networking, but with more steam and less small talk. And speaking of things done in silence, let's talk about punishment. Because feudal Japan had a very strong sense of order, and justice could be, well, creative. Petty theft could get your hand chopped off. Arson? Execution. Talking back to your superior? Not advised. But if you were a samurai and dishonored yourself, you might be allowed to die honorably instead of being executed like a commoner. For peasants, the laws were more about deterrence than fairness. If someone in your village committed a crime, your entire community might be punished. Collective guilt. It kept everyone watching each other, like a medieval HOA but with swords. And yet, for all this control, people found small joys. Festivals were rare but lively. Fireworks, masks, music, and sake. That rice wine was basically Japan's answer to emotional therapy. You couldn't rise in class, but you could at least dance under the paper lanterns and forget for one night that your taxes were due. By now, you might be thinking life in feudal Japan sounds exhausting, and yes, it was. But it was also beautifully structured in a way that somehow worked. Hierarchy wasn't just enforced, it was believed in. People genuinely thought they were part of a grand cosmic order. The emperor as divine, the shogun as chosen, the samurai as moral examples, and everyone else as essential support characters. It was like a massive historical RPG where nobody got to change their class. Now, let's float forward, past the muddy rice fields and the castle walls, and look at what happened when Japan's feudal bubble finally started to wobble. Because when you spend centuries perfecting obedience, what happens when the outside world suddenly knocks on your paper door? Part 3. The slow collapse of the samurai world. So, we're back. Still calm, still sleepy, still stuck somewhere between a bamboo grove and a collapsing shogunate. By now, we've wandered through the rice fields, peasant huts, and samurai mansions of feudal Japan. Everyone's doing their part. The system's been stable for centuries and everything is very neat, which of course means it's about to fall apart, because that's what history does best. Let's ease into the 17th century, the Edo period, the final and most polished version of Japan's feudal age. This is where things got weirdly peaceful, like suspiciously peaceful. For over 250 years, Japan basically said, "No wars, please. We're tired." The Tokugawa shogunate had unified the country after centuries of chaos, and with that unity came paperwork. The samurai class, once these fierce battlefield warriors, suddenly found themselves doing desk jobs. Imagine being raised to die gloriously in combat, only to end up filling tax records in perfect brushstrokes. That was the new normal. And here's the awkward part. Samurai couldn't farm, trade, or make money like commoners. They were supposed to live on stipends, regular payments from their lords, which worked fine until the economy evolved and those stipends didn't. Over time, the samurai became kind of broke. Picture proud warriors pawning their armor for rent, or writing sad poetry about how expensive rice had become. The merchants, those supposedly lowly townsfolk, were now richer than the warriors who once looked down on them, which must have been fun at dinner parties. And since samurai weren't allowed to work outside their status, many of them lived in quiet poverty, clinging to a code of honor no one could afford anymore. It's like the entire warrior class slowly turned into a historical cosplay club. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The Edo period also gave us some of Japan's most iconic cultural refinements. Kabuki theater was booming, colorful, loud, scandalous. It started as entertainment for the common people, but quickly got too popular for the authorities' comfort. Naturally, they tried to ban women from performing, so men just played all the parts instead. Because sure, that fixes everything. Then there was ukiyo-e, those famous woodblock prints of courtesans, landscapes, and occasionally sumo wrestlers. The floating world was a nickname for Japan's pleasure districts, where reality politely took a coffee break. Tea houses, art, and poetry all flourished. Even the poorest townsfolk might save up for a single beautiful print, like a medieval version of owning limited edition fan merch. Meanwhile, the samurai were writing moral guides about discipline, honor, and proper sitting posture. Yes, posture. They truly were the influencers of stillness. And over all this, the Tokugawa shogunate kept an iron grip on everything. Travel was restricted. Foreign contact was banned. The country literally locked itself off from the rest of the world for over 2 centuries. The policy was called sakoku, or closed country. No one in, no one out. Well, except for a few Dutch traders who were confined to a single tiny artificial island in Nagasaki Bay. Because apparently, Japan wanted foreign goods, just not foreign people. This isolation worked surprisingly well. Japan was peaceful, self-sufficient, and culturally rich, but it also became stagnant. While Europe was busy industrializing, colonizing, and inventing coffee addiction, Japan was still running on rice taxes and rigid class codes. And then, in 1853, something black and smoky appeared on the horizon. American warships, led by a man named Commodore Matthew Perry, who basically showed up uninvited and said, "Open your ports, or else." The Japanese had never seen anything like these ships. Huge, metal, steam-powered monsters. They called them kurafune, black ships. And suddenly, the entire centuries-old isolation policy crumbled like a badly made rice cracker. The shogunate had no choice but to sign trade treaties. And those treaties weren't exactly equal. Western powers basically said, "We'll sell you stuff, you'll sell us stuff, and we'll set the prices." Cool? It wasn't cool. The economy was shaken, the samurai were furious, and the old balance of power started to unravel. Picture this. Samurai, raised to defend tradition, now forced to watch foreigners stroll through their ports, wearing top hats and smoking cigars. It was humiliating. Some wanted revenge, others wanted reform, and the whole country started buzzing with tension. The shogunate tried to hold things together, but cracks were everywhere. Young intellectuals started whispering about modernization. They studied Western science, military tactics, and, inevitably, fashion. One man's frock coat was another man's existential crisis. By the 1860s, Japan was split between those who wanted to open up and modernize, and those who wanted to throw the foreigners back into the sea, which, considering Japan's geography, was both symbolic and practical. Eventually, it all came to a head in 1868 with what we now call the Meiji Restoration. The emperor, a teenager at the time, was restored to power, ending more than 250 years of shogunate rule. The samurai system, the class hierarchy, the feudal structure, gone. Just like that, Japan officially stepped into the modern world. Of course, modern is a relative term. The transition was messy. Some samurai refused to let go of their old ways. They rebelled, they fought, they lost. One famous example was the Satsuma Rebellion in 1877, led by Saigo Takamori, often called the last true samurai. His story is basically tragic poetry in motion. A noble warrior standing against modernization, knowing it would destroy everything he believed in. He lost, of course, but he died with dignity, which is about as samurai as it gets. After that, Japan raced to modernize. Railroads, factories, Western uniforms, a new army. It was like centuries of isolation had bottled up all that ambition and then suddenly uncorked it. But deep down, that old feudal mindset, the obsession with order, loyalty, and hierarchy, never really disappeared. It just adapted. You can still feel echoes of it in Japanese culture today. The quiet discipline, the group harmony, the sense that everyone has a role to play. Feudal Japan might have ended on paper, but its ghost lingers in tea ceremonies, bowing rituals, and the simple elegance of a garden arranged just so. And honestly, there's something oddly peaceful about that, a civilization that lived through centuries of hardship, order, and transformation, and somehow came out calm. So next time you see a serene Japanese landscape painting, remember, behind that quiet beauty was a world of endless rice taxes, strict hierarchies, and samurai trying really hard not to show emotion. Let's float into the final stretch next, where we'll explore the lasting legacy of Japan's feudal mindset and how its centuries-old structure still whispers through modern life today. Part 4. The Legacy of Feudal Japan and its echo in modern culture. All right, welcome back. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You've officially survived several hundred years of rice, swords, and social anxiety. Let's take a deep breath, stretch a little, maybe pour some tea. Tonight, we're gliding through the quiet aftermath. What happened after feudal Japan technically ended? Spoiler, the mindset didn't exactly pack up and leave. Even after the Meiji, Restoration turned everything upside down. A lot of people just kept living the same way. The old social hierarchy was gone, but the habits stayed. Samurai may have lost their swords, but not their pride. Peasants were suddenly free, but most of them still worked the same plots of land for the same families. Change was official, but it wasn't personal. And that's kind of the theme of post-feudal Japan. The illusion of transformation wrapped in centuries of cultural muscle memory. Let's start with the samurai, because of course we should. When the Meiji government abolished their privileges, it didn't exactly offer them new careers. A few went into politics or the military, but most had no clue what to do with themselves. Imagine spending your whole life mastering swordsmanship, only to find out your country now wants you to learn accounting. Some adapted, some didn't. A lot of samurai families became teachers or bureaucrats, the closest thing to honorable service left. Others opened small businesses or, reluctantly, became farmers. And then there were those who simply refused to change, clinging to their ideals like old armor in the attic. Even the famous Bushido code, that whole honor until death thing, evolved. It stopped being a literal warrior code and turned into a moral philosophy for everyone. Work hard, be loyal, stay humble, don't embarrass the group. Basically, Bushido became Japan's version of keep calm and carry on. You can still see echoes of it today in Japan's work culture. The discipline, the punctuality, the quiet endurance. Modern salarymen might not wield katanas, but they do wield PowerPoint slides with terrifying precision. And let's not forget loyalty. Feudal Japan revolved around serving one's lord. Now, it's the company. Back then, samurai died for their daimyo. Now, people stay at their jobs until midnight, bowing to the vending machine for moral support. Of course, there's a bit of irony in all this. The Meiji era's whole point was modernization, breaking free from feudalism, but it ended up preserving its spirit in new, sneaky ways. For example, the emperor, once a distant, semi-divine figure hidden behind palace walls, suddenly became the symbol of national unity. Before, people served local lords. Now they served the emperor. Same structure, just with a single shiny head at the top. And the army. Oh, they loved that samurai ethos. The government poured it straight into the new military's DNA. Discipline, sacrifice, obedience. By the early 20th century, Japan's soldiers were basically modern samurai with rifles, still bound by a code of honor that often meant, don't surrender, ever. That mindset helped fuel Japan's rapid rise as a military power, and later, some pretty dark chapters in the early 1900s. But we're not diving into the war era tonight. Too noisy for bedtime. Let's stay in the softer light of the cultural legacy. Because despite all the hierarchy and hardship, feudal Japan left behind some of the most peaceful, beautiful expressions of human creativity. Zen gardens, ink paintings, haiku poetry, tea ceremonies that turn simplicity into art. There's something fascinating about a society so obsessed with control and structure managing to produce such delicate stillness. It's like the more rigid the system got, the more beauty people found in the smallest things. The shape of a tea bowl, the sound of water dripping in a bamboo pipe, the pause between breaths. Even the architecture reflected that calm discipline. Wooden homes with sliding doors, designed to harmonize with nature. Tatami mats measured down to the inch. Every detail intentional, quiet, balanced. In a world where social mobility was basically non-existent, at least the house could be symmetrical. And then there's the lasting image of the samurai, not the real messy, debt-ridden bureaucrat version, but the mythic one. Hollywood loves that guy, the stoic warrior, perfectly calm, bound by honor, walking into the sunset with a sword he can't afford to replace. But what's interesting is that even in Japan, that myth became comforting. As modern life got faster and more industrialized, people romanticized the old order, the idea of clear purpose, loyalty, and quiet strength. It's why samurai films in the mid-20th century hit so hard. They were nostalgic lullabies for a world that never really existed. And the irony, if an actual medieval samurai could time travel to modern Tokyo, he'd probably faint. Too many bright lights, too many rules about trains, too many people politely ignoring each other. But he'd also recognize something familiar. The bowing, the structure, the unspoken social codes, the respect for hierarchy and harmony. It's feudalism in a business suit. Let's talk about another leftover. Japan's obsession with order. In feudal times, it was enforced by birth. Now, it's socialized. Everyone just kind of agrees to keep things running smoothly. The trains arrive on time, the streets are spotless, and people queue like it's a moral duty. It's beautiful, but also a bit exhausting, the same sense of group obligation that once kept peasants in line under their lords now keeps office workers from leaving before the boss. History really does have a sense of humor. But maybe that's the charm of Japan's evolution. It didn't just erase its past, it repurposed it. The discipline that once built castles now builds microchips. The humility that once served lords now serves the collective. Good. The poetry once written under candlelight now fits into Twitter-length haikus that people still write for fun. So yes, life in feudal Japan was brutal, rigid, suffocating, and unfair. But it also shaped a civilization that learned to find peace within structure, beauty within limits, and meaning in repetition. You can still feel it today in a quiet Kyoto street, where a monk sweeps fallen cherry blossoms into perfect little piles, or in the stillness of a commuter train, where no one speaks yet everyone understands, the shared rhythm of silence. It's centuries of feudal conditioning, turned into art, and maybe that's what makes Japan's history so soothing to drift through at night. It's not about perfection or progress or glory. It's about endurance. It's about the quiet grace of people who learned to live within the walls of their world and somehow made it beautiful. Now, before you drift off, here's a gentle thought to end on. The samurai are gone. The castles are ruins. The rice taxes are history. But the calm order they built still hums softly in the background. In the way a teacup is placed, or how someone bows before speaking. It's the faint heartbeat of feudal Japan, still echoing through time. Part 5. The Samurai, Duty, Death, and Really Bad Poetry. All right. So by now, you've probably noticed that feudal Japan wasn't exactly a paradise. But let's drift quietly into one of the most famous and most misunderstood groups from this era. The samurai. Now the image we have today is pretty polished. Stoic warriors in perfect armor, swords gleaming, speaking in deep haikus about honor before gracefully slicing the air. But in reality, the samurai were, well, a mix of bureaucrats, minor landlords, and guys who occasionally decapitated each other for a promotion. By the Kamakura period, which started around 1185, Japan had basically turned into a giant military hierarchy. The emperor was technically still in charge, but only in the same way your office printer technically belongs to everyone. In truth, the shogun, the military dictator, ran the show, and the samurai were his loyal enforcers. They followed a strict code called Bushido, which translates roughly to the way of the warrior. It sounds noble, right? Except it mostly boiled down to be loyal, don't complain, and if things go bad, kill yourself neatly. That last part was seppuku, or ritual suicide. It was considered the honorable way out if you failed your master or embarrassed yourself. You'd sit down, dress properly, compose a farewell poem, and then, well, you can imagine the rest. Your best friend would sometimes help by finishing the job with a clean slice, which sounds nice until you realize that's a lot of pressure to put on a friendship. But before you picture rows of noble samurai meditating under cherry blossoms, remember, many of them were glorified tax collectors. They lived off the rice grown by peasants, took a hefty cut, and occasionally got into brawls with rival clans. And when there wasn't a war going on, they were bored out of their minds. So they wrote poetry, bad poetry, or they practiced calligraphy, or they sat around composing moral essays about how to die gracefully. You could say it was a national hobby, turning despair into philosophy. And for a while, this system worked. The samurai got paid, the peasants kept planting rice, and everyone pretended that loyalty and honor were the same thing. But then, as always, humans started being humans again. Ambitious, petty, and slightly paranoid. Because once you create a warrior class trained to fight, they eventually want to fight. And if there's no enemy to fight, well, they'll just fight each other. This brings us to the late Muromachi period, where Japan basically turned into a real-life version of Game of Thrones without the dragons or the personal hygiene. The country fractured into dozens of warring domains, each ruled by its own daimyo, a feudal lord with a personal army and a fragile ego. The result? The Sengoku Jidai, or Warring States period, which lasted from the mid-1400s to the early 1600s. That's almost 150 years of chaos, betrayal, sieges, and dramatic helmet hair. Peasants were drafted into armies, castles burned, alliances shifted weekly, and everyone was convinced they were destined to unify Japan. Spoiler, most of them weren't, but amid the endless wars a few big names rose up. You've got Oda Nobunaga, the ruthless visionary who thought diplomacy was a waste of time and firearms were the future. Then there's Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who started as a peasant and somehow became Japan's ruler. A rags to riches story if you ignore all the executions. And finally, Tokugawa Ieyasu, the patient schemer who waited everyone else out, then took the throne and built the Tokugawa shogunate. We'll float toward him in a moment, but first, let's talk about the common folk caught in the middle. For peasants, the Sengoku era was basically a rolling disaster. You'd spend a decade rebuilding after one war, only for another lord to come along and torch everything again. Families fled from region to region, bandits roamed freely, and rice taxes kept rising to pay for endless campaigns. But weirdly, out of this chaos came innovation. Blacksmiths learned to mass-produce swords. Castle design advanced dramatically, with complex moats and tall keeps. Trade routes flourished wherever peace temporarily took hold. In a strange, backhanded way, war was the one thing keeping the economy alive. Of course, it also meant samurai had more chances to prove themselves, or die trying. By this point, the line between a noble samurai and a desperate mercenary was razor thin. Many ronin or masterless samurai wandered the land looking for work, purpose, or maybe just a decent meal. They were like freelancers before the internet, underpaid, overworked, and forever one bad review away from ruin. Some became bandits, others became poets, A few even became monks, because when you've seen enough chaos, enlightenment starts to sound pretty good. And yet, through all the destruction, the ideal of Bushido somehow survived. The notion that honor mattered more than wealth or power, that loyalty was sacred. It was romantic, sure, but also deeply tragic, because it often meant dying for someone who wouldn't have done the same for you. Let's drift now to the man who finally ended all this noise, Tokugawa Ieyasu, a man who turned centuries of chaos into 250 years of peace, though as we'll see, his version of peace came with its own quiet misery. So, dim the lights a little more, and let's float over to the dawn of the Tokugawa era, where everything looked serene on the surface, but underneath, society was still stitched together with fear, rice, and repressed ambition. Part 6. The Tokugawa Shogunate, Peace, Control and the Art of Being Bored. So here we are. After centuries of chaos, betrayal and badly written death poems, Japan finally got its act together. Sort of. In 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu declared himself shogun, officially starting the Tokugawa shogunate, or the Edo period. This was the longest stretch of political stability Japan had ever seen. Over 250 years of peace. Which sounds great, right? Except peace under Tokugawa rule wasn't exactly peaceful. It was more like carefully managed boredom. The kind of calm that comes when everyone's too scared to breathe wrong. Let's start with the man himself. Ieyasu. He wasn't the romantic warrior type. He was more like your quiet, calculating uncle who never raises his voice but somehow always gets his way. He survived endless betrayals, waited for every rival to slip up, and by the time the dust settled, he'd built a government that could outlast all of them. His genius wasn't in battle, it was in control. Under the Tokugawa system, Japan became a strictly hierarchical society. At the top was the shogun. Beneath him were the daimyo, the feudal lords who controlled their own domains but swore absolute loyalty to him. Below them were the samurai, then the peasants, then artisans, and finally merchants, who were technically at the bottom, though they'd later become annoyingly rich. Every person knew their place, and stepping out of it wasn't an option. To make sure the daimyo behaved, Ieyasu came up with a clever little rule called sankin kotai, or alternate attendance. Each daimyo had to spend every other year in Edo, modern Tokyo, leaving their families behind as glorified hostages when they returned home. That's right, imagine running your region, but your kids and wife have to live under government supervision just in case you get any ideas about rebellion. It was like a medieval version of a company loyalty program, only with more political surveillance and worse housing. The samurai, meanwhile, were stuck in a strange identity crisis. For generations, they'd been warriors, men who lived and died by the sword. But now, with no wars left to fight, their swords were mostly decorative. Instead of charging into battle, they were expected to read Confucian philosophy, enforce laws, and look dignified in official ceremonies. In other words, they became civil servants with really nice outfits. Many samurai struggled with this new reality. Their stipends, paid in rice, barely covered the cost of living. Debt was rampant. Some even had to take side jobs, which was technically beneath their station. The Bushido ideal was still there, whispering in their heads. But it was hard to feel honorable when you were borrowing money from the merchant class you were supposed to despise. Ah yes, the merchants, the supposed bottom of the social ladder. Except they were the ones running the economy. Trade within Japan boomed. Cities like Osaka and Edo exploded in size, and suddenly the people who weren't supposed to matter mattered a lot. Merchants built fortunes. They sponsored art, theatre, and entertainment. And while samurai looked down on them, they still lined up to buy what they sold. Because let's face it, even the most disciplined warrior couldn't resist a nice silk robe or a good cup of sake. Speaking of entertainment, this was the era when Japanese urban culture really blossomed. Kabuki theatre, woodblock prints, pleasure quarters, and the rise of what historians now call the floating world. A vibrant nightlife scene where people could escape the rigid social order for a few hours of fantasy. It was escapism, pure and simple. You'd have merchants mingling with courtesans, poets chatting with actors, and everyone pretending they weren't trapped in a social system that dictated their every move. And in the middle of all that, the shogunate kept a tight grip on everything. Travel between domains was restricted, weapons were controlled, foreign contact was banned under the sakoku, or closed country policy. For over 2 centuries, Japan sealed itself off from the world. No trade, no missionaries, no new ideas, just isolation. It wasn't total, of course. The Dutch were allowed one tiny trading post on Dejima Island, and China kept limited contact. But for most people, the outside world may as well have been another planet. From the Tokugawa perspective, it made sense. Europe was in the middle of its global empire-building phase, and Japan had seen what happened to places that let foreign powers in too easily. So they shut the doors and decided to handle things their way, and honestly, it worked. Japan stayed remarkably stable. Cities grew, literacy rates rose, art flourished, and violent crime was practically non-existent. But it came at a cost: stagnation. Without outside influence or innovation, Japan's technology and military development froze. The same system that brought peace also strangled progress. Everyone knew their place, but that meant nobody could rise above it. By the mid-1800s, Japan was still living in a samurai daydream while the rest of the world had moved into the age of steam engines and colonial empires. And that's when the Americans showed up. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry arrived with his famous black ships, demanding Japan open its ports to trade. You can imagine how that went over in a country that hadn't seen a foreign fleet in 200 years. The shogunate panicked. Some wanted to fight, others wanted to negotiate, and the emperor, who had been a symbolic figure for centuries, suddenly started to matter again. Perry left, but he'd lit the fuse. Within a few years, the shogunate would collapse. The samurai class would vanish, and Japan would rush headfirst into modernization. But before we get there, let's drift a bit longer in the twilight of the Tokugawa era, a time of beauty, discipline, and quiet decay. Because beneath all that order and serenity was a system that looked stable only because everyone was too afraid to move. Part 7. The Fall of the Shogunate. When peace cracked quietly. So, by the mid-1800s, Japan had been running on the same operating system for more than 2 centuries. The Tokugawa shogunate had perfected control. Every samurai knew their place. Every merchant knew their limits. Every farmer knew how much rice to hand over. It was all very organized. But like any long-running system, cracks started to show. It wasn't loud or dramatic at first. It was quiet, subtle, a few bad harvests, some corruption here and there, a sense that the world outside was moving faster than anyone wanted to admit. Then came those black ships. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry rolled up to Edo Bay with a fleet of steam-powered warships that looked like something out of a fever dream. The Japanese had never seen anything like them. smoke-belching, iron-clad monsters carrying cannons that could flatten a city block. Perry politely, or maybe not so politely, handed over a letter from the US president, demanding Japan open its ports for trade. Then he left, giving the shogunate a year to think it over. That was, of course, a diplomatic way of saying, "We'll be back, and you'd better say yes." The shogunate freaked out. They called emergency councils, argued for months, and finally realized that their centuries of isolation had left them totally unprepared to deal with the outside world. When Perry returned, Japan signed the Treaty of Kanagawa, opening a couple of ports to American ships. And just like that, the wall of isolation that had stood since the 1600s began to crumble. Other Western powers followed. Britain, Russia, France, they all wanted a peace. More treaties were signed, each one chipping away at Japanese sovereignty. For a society that prized order and control above all else, this was humiliating. Many samurai, especially the younger ones, saw the shogunate's weakness as a betrayal. They'd been raised on ideals of honor and loyalty, and now their leaders were bowing to foreign demands. It didn't sit well. Out of that anger came a new slogan: Sono Joy. Revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. Which was ironic, because nobody had cared much about the emperor in centuries. The imperial family still existed in Kyoto, but they were mostly ceremonial. Suddenly, though, people started to see the emperor as a symbol of national pride, someone untainted by the failures of the shogunate. The samurai who believed this became part of a growing movement to restore imperial rule. Meanwhile, Japan was going through a kind of identity crisis. Western influence started seeping in. There were foreign merchants, missionaries, and even bits of modern technology appearing in ports like Yokohama. You could see steamships, glassware, even photography. For many Japanese, it must have felt like the future was arriving overnight, and it wasn't waiting for permission. Inside the shogunate, things got messy. The government was divided between conservatives who wanted to keep things as they were, and reformists who believed Japan needed to modernize fast. But modernization required admitting weakness, and that wasn't exactly the samurai way. By the 1860s, open rebellion was brewing. Clans like Choshu and Satsuma, long rivals of the Tokugawa, started building alliances, stockpiling weapons, and quietly supporting the idea of imperial restoration. They were done waiting. Then, in 1867, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, the last shogun, did something no one expected. He stepped down. He handed political power back to the emperor, hoping it would preserve peace and maybe keep the Tokugawa name relevant in the new system. It was a graceful move in theory, but the reformist factions didn't trust him. They accused him of clinging to influence behind the scenes, and soon, what had been a peaceful transition turned into a civil war, the Boshin War. It wasn't huge by global standards, but for Japan, it was the turning point. Samurai fought samurai. Some sided with the shogunate, others with the imperial cause. But unlike the old wars of the Sengoku era, this one featured rifles, artillery, and even ironclad ships. Japan was literally fighting over its past and its future at the same time. In 1869, the shogunate's forces surrendered. The emperor, now Emperor Meiji, was officially restored to power, and the old order, the entire feudal system that had defined Japan for centuries, quietly disappeared. The samurai class was dissolved. The daimyo lost their domains, and the shogunate, once the most powerful government in Asia, was gone. It wasn't a bloody revolution, at least not compared to others in world history. It was more like a long, exhausted sigh at the end of an era, but the change it unleashed was massive. The Meiji Restoration wasn't just about politics. It was about transformation, an entire civilization trying to modernize overnight. Western clothing, modern schools, a national army, railways, telegraphs, it all came pouring in. And yet, the people who had lived their whole lives under the quiet, structured world of Tokugawa Japan must have felt completely disoriented. Imagine being a samurai who spent decades training for a war that never came, suddenly told to give up your sword and get a desk job, or a merchant who spent your life under social restrictions, suddenly being told that wealth actually mattered now. It was exciting for some, terrifying for others. By the time the Meiji period truly got rolling, the Japan of feudal lords and wandering samurai was gone. The country had traded centuries of isolation for a headlong sprint into industrialization. And yet, if you listen closely to the quiet streets of old Kyoto or the wooden houses of Edo, now Tokyo, you can still feel it, the ghost of that orderly, rigid, beautiful, suffocating world. A world where honor was currency, peace was control, and life, while stable, was anything but free. Let's drift, just a little longer, through those fading shadows. Because even as Japan woke up to the modern age, part of it never really left that sleepy, feudal dream behind. Part 8. The Ghost of the Samurai. What came after? Feudal Japan. After the dust settled from the fall of the shogunate, Japan looked around and realized it had pulled off something astonishing. It had ended centuries of feudal rule without completely imploding. The country didn't fragment, the emperor was back in power, and the Meiji Restoration had, at least on paper, unified Japan under a single national identity. But in reality, the ghosts of feudal Japan were still everywhere. Let's start with the samurai. These guys had been the backbone of Japanese society for centuries. They weren't just soldiers. They were symbols of discipline, loyalty, and the idea that dying with honor was better than living in shame. Now imagine being told, basically overnight, that your sword, your status, and your entire way of life were obsolete. By the 1870s, the new government passed reforms that banned wearing swords in public. They also introduced conscription, meaning ordinary farmers and townsmen could now join the army. That didn't go over well. A lot of samurai felt betrayed. They'd spent their lives studying Bushido, the way of the warrior, and now they were being replaced by peasants with rifles. Some tried to adapt, becoming teachers, administrators, or businessmen. Others didn't take it so well. One of the most famous examples was Saigo Takamori, sometimes called the last true samurai. Saigo had actually helped lead the Meiji Restoration, believing it would purify Japan and strengthen the emperor's rule. But when the government started adopting Western dress codes, abolishing samurai privileges, and sending students overseas to learn foreign ways, he began to regret it. He wanted Japan to modernize, sure, but not to lose its soul. In 1877, Saigo led the Satsuma Rebellion, a samurai uprising against the new government. It was doomed from the start. The imperial army, now equipped with modern rifles and artillery, crushed the rebels. Saigo's forces fought bravely but were hopelessly outgunned. When defeat became inevitable, Saigo took his own life in traditional samurai fashion. It was the symbolic end of an era. And yet, even as samurai culture was being dismantled, it didn't vanish, it transformed. The new Meiji state carefully repackaged old samurai values into something more useful for a modern nation. National loyalty. Bushido, once about serving one's feudal lord, was reinterpreted as loyalty to the emperor and the state. Schools began teaching moral education inspired by Bushido, honor, duty, obedience. These became the virtues of the new citizen. You could say Japan didn't really kill the samurai spirit. It just turned it into patriotism with better uniforms. Meanwhile, the merchant class, the ones who had been stuck at the bottom of the old hierarchy, suddenly found themselves in a very different world. Money mattered now. Trade was booming. Factories were being built. Families that had once been looked down upon for being lowly traders were now founding powerful industrial conglomerates known as zaibatsu. Think Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, Mitsui, names that still exist today. It must have been strange, watching the social order flip upside down. The people who had once served samurai were now funding railways and owning shipping lines. The samurai's descendants were working as clerks in offices. That's one of the quiet tragedies of the Meiji transition. It wasn't violent in the streets, but it was deeply disorienting for those who lived through it. The architecture changed too. Western-style buildings began to appear in Tokyo and Yokohama, with gas lamps and glass windows. Men started wearing suits, women's hairstyles shifted, but step into the countryside and life still looked medieval. Most Japanese were still farmers, living in wooden homes, growing rice, and paying taxes in grain. The roads were dusty. The nights were dark. You could walk for hours without seeing anything that felt modern. It's easy to forget how slowly cultural change actually spreads. Even as the emperor sat in a Western-style palace in Tokyo, peasants were still bowing to their village shrines, whispering prayers to rice gods, and clinging to the rhythm of the old seasons. And that's the strange beauty of Japan's transformation. It wasn't a clean break from the past. It was a layering of eras, feudal customs, Buddhist beliefs, and new industrial ambitions all coexisted, awkwardly but persistently. Of course, there were growing pains. The government's modernization programs required massive spending. That meant higher taxes. Farmers who couldn't keep up lost their land. Rural poverty deepened, even as cities began to hum with industry. In a way, the Meiji period created two Japans, one charging into the future and another quietly left behind. By the 1880s, Japan had a national army, a parliament and railways stretching across the islands. But it also had villages where people still believed fox spirits caused illness. The samurai might have vanished from the streets, but their influence lingered in subtle ways. Discipline, precision, formality. You could see it in everything from military drills to tea ceremonies. And yet, that very discipline would one day carry Japan into darker places, because as the nation modernized, it also began to build an empire. By the 1890s, Japan was fighting wars against China and Russia. Wars it actually won. That old samurai sense of duty and sacrifice found a new home in nationalism. It's eerie to think that the same values that once bound a man to his feudal lord were now binding a generation to the emperor, and, later, to the state's military ambitions. But we'll leave that thread for another night. For now, picture this. The 1870s countryside at dusk. The air smells like wood smoke. Somewhere, a farmer is ploughing a rice field under the fading light. In a nearby town, a former samurai in a western jacket teaches calligraphy to schoolchildren, who will grow up in a world he barely understands. The shogun is gone. The swords are gone. But the quiet, stubborn rhythm of Japan carries on. And that's the thing about the end of an era. It never really ends. It just lingers in the corners of memory, in old rituals, in the way people bow, in how they value silence and precision. Feudal Japan may have fallen, but its spirit never left the islands. It just went to sleep under a different name. Part 9. The Afterlife of Feudal Japan. Echoes in the Modern World. So, as Japan marched into the 20th century, the age of the samurai was technically long gone, but spiritually not so much. You could say feudal Japan refused to die quietly. It slipped its armor off, put on a school uniform, and went right on influencing everything from education to corporate etiquette. Let's start with the social hierarchy. In theory, the Meiji reforms had abolished the rigid class system of samurai, peasants, artisans, and merchants. Everyone was now officially a citizen. But of course, you can't just erase centuries of social conditioning with a few new laws. Old habits die slowly, especially when they're built into the way people think. For generations, Japanese society had been obsessed with order, obedience, and knowing one's place. That didn't vanish with the emperor's decree. It just evolved into something new, a quiet, almost invisible web of respect and deference that still shapes Japanese culture today. You can see it in the workplace, the way employees bow to their superiors, the unspoken rules about seniority, the careful politeness that guides almost every interaction. It's feudalism's ghost, wearing a modern suit. Even the idea of giri, the sense of duty and obligation, remained powerful. In the samurai world, it meant loyalty to one's lord. In modern Japan, it means responsibility to one's company, family, or society. Different setting, same energy. There's a certain calm to that continuity, though. It's like Japan collectively decided that tradition wasn't something to rebel against. It was something to repurpose. But not everything aged gracefully. Remember those peasants who had been tied to the land for centuries? Well, by the early 1900s, many of them were still struggling. Industrialization had created jobs, but mostly in the cities. So entire families migrated from villages to urban centers, often living in cramped, dimly lit apartments. Tokyo, Osaka, Yokohama all became magnets for ambition and exhaustion. The rhythm of feudal Japan, the seasons, the rice fields, the slow passage of time, gave way to factory whistles and streetcars. You might think that meant people left their old beliefs behind. But no. Shinto rituals, Buddhist funerals, ancestral altars, those things persisted even in the most crowded city blocks. It's one of those quiet contradictions that define Japan, hypermodern, yet deeply ancient at the same time. And while the Meiji state celebrated progress, it also looked backward for moral legitimacy. The government actually encouraged nostalgia for the samurai past. School textbooks romanticized Bushido. Young students memorized the imperial rescript on education, which taught loyalty, sacrifice, and reverence for authority. It was history as bedtime story, but one that quietly shaped the national mindset. By the time Japan entered the early 20th century, the feudal spirit had been reborn as militarism. The new army idolized samurai discipline. Soldiers were trained to see death in battle as the ultimate act of loyalty. Sound familiar? That mindset carried Japan into wars across Asia and the Pacific. The old samurai code, once about personal honor, became a national ideology. It's sobering, really. The same values that once governed peaceful tea ceremonies now marched under military banners. Of course, after World War II, Japan faced yet another transformation. The empire fell. The cities were in ruins. The emperor, once considered divine, publicly renounced that status. And yet, just like before, the culture adapted, rather than collapsed. The focus shifted from serving lords or emperors to serving communities, companies, and families. The quiet discipline that once defined samurai life was now poured into craftsmanship, design, and industry. That's how you get things like kaizen, the philosophy of continuous improvement in Japanese business. It's essentially Bushido for the modern worker: precision, humility, and relentless dedication to one's craft. Even something as mundane as the Japanese tea ceremony carries echoes of feudal order. Every motion, how you bow, how you pour, how you sip, is deliberate. It's a tiny ritual of mindfulness, centuries old, still performed in a skyscraper city. And when you look at Japan today, its calm efficiency, its politeness, its obsession with perfection, you can almost see the outline of a samurai bowing silently in the background. That's the strange thing about feudal Japan. It ended, but it didn't. The armor rusted, the castles fell, but the mindset lingered. It seeped into every quiet corner of Japanese life. Even pop culture carries the echo. Every samurai movie, every anime hero obsessed with honor or discipline, every tea garden designed for stillness. It's all a whisper from that distant, disciplined age. If you walk through Kyoto at night, you can still feel it. The soft light of lanterns, the wooden streets that creak under your steps, the faint scent of incense drifting from a temple. Somewhere, behind a sliding paper door, someone is practicing calligraphy with the same brushstrokes their ancestors used 400 years ago. It's like time folds in on itself there. The past never really left. It just learned how to coexist with the future. So yes, life in feudal Japan was brutal, hierarchical, and often unfair. But it also produced an astonishingly durable culture, one that could bend without breaking. And maybe that's why the story of feudal Japan still fascinates us today. It's not just the swords or the castles or the dramatic duels under cherry blossoms. It's the way an entire civilization built its identity on silence, structure, and grace, and somehow carried those things into a chaotic modern world. If you listen closely enough, you can still hear it. Not the clash of blades or the orders of a shogun, just the quiet sound of rain on temple roofs, the echo of discipline in an age that has forgotten what that means. The story of feudal Japan isn't just history, it's a mood, and it lingers. Part 10. Reflection. The quiet legacy of feudal Japan. So here we are, at the gentle close of our long drift through feudal Japan. By now, we've seen centuries of samurai discipline, daimyo intrigue, peasant toil, and the rise and fall of the Tokugawa shogunate. We've watched Japan wrestle with its own isolation, open its doors to the outside world, and struggle to reconcile centuries of tradition with the irresistible pull of modernity. It's tempting, when we tell this story, to focus on battles, betrayals, or dramatic political shifts, but the true story, the one that lingers quietly, like a candle flicker in a Kyoto alley, is about continuity and adaptation. Feudal Japan was structured, rigid, and sometimes brutally unfair. People were born into roles they couldn't escape. Loyalties were absolute. Honor, duty, and hierarchy shaped every action. And yet, those same structures produced resilience, patience, and cultural cohesion. Think about it. The samurai might have disappeared physically, their swords tucked away in museums or melted down for industry. But the values they lived by, discipline, precision, loyalty, and an almost meditative focus on their craft, persisted. They were carried forward by ordinary citizens, merchants, educators, and eventually workers in factories and offices. Even modern Japan's global success is rooted in these quiet, almost invisible legacies: the meticulous attention to detail in manufacturing, the respect for order and hierarchy in schools and workplaces, the calm, structured rhythm of daily life. These are all echoes of a past that many imagine as violent or chaotic, but was in truth governed by rigorous rules and habits. And while feudal Japan had its tragedies, harsh punishments, rigid social constraints, occasional famines, it also had moments of beauty and reflection: ceremonial tea, meticulously planned gardens, poetry, calligraphy, architecture, and festivals all thrived within the framework of a disciplined society. The people were bound by rules, yes, but those rules also allowed them to cultivate art, community, and personal refinement. It's ironic, really. The same system that stifled freedom and dictated lives also gave Japan the cultural DNA to endure through massive upheaval. The shogunate fell. The samurai lost their privileges. The empire rose and fell. Wars were fought. Cities burned, and new systems of government took hold. Yet through it all, Japan retained a remarkable sense of identity, a continuity of values that allowed it to adapt without losing its core. So as we close this long, sleepy look at feudal Japan, here's a thought. History isn't always about spectacle or drama. Sometimes it's about the quiet persistence of ideas, habits, and social rhythms. About the invisible threads that tie centuries together, even as everything on the surface changes. Next time you see a perfectly arranged garden, a ceremonial teacup, or even a bustling train station operating like clockwork, you might pause for a second and imagine the centuries of quiet, disciplined lives that shaped that moment. Imagine the samurai bowing, the merchants calculating, the peasants planting rice, all flowing together into the rhythms of the present. That's the gift of feudal Japan. Not swords, not battles, not shoguns, but a culture so deeply embedded in the fabric of daily life that it could survive collapse and still quietly guide the future. And as you lie back tonight, thinking about samurai, shoguns, and the rice fields under the setting sun, remember this: history doesn't just happen, it whispers, it lingers, and sometimes it puts you gently to sleep. Good night.